Does off season involve 3 to 4 weeks of cross training? Is that an off season? Or if you do more cross training, is that part of an off season? Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know how to define that.
Hey everybody, Doug Adams here with Scott Greenberg for the RunDNA Podcast. So welcome back. We're kind of getting started and rolling in the second season of this. And Scott, how you been? How's everything going?
Doing good. Busy but good.
Yeah, Scott's at a rest stop right now.
I am.
If
you need some things to do in Central Florida, I've got the pamphlets behind me, so we're ready to go.
Yes. And just a disclaimer, this is not sponsored by Wendy's.
Not sponsored by Wendy's.
Grabbing his Wendy's cup here, and we're getting images of it there, which seems uncharacteristic for you to like French fries and soda. I'm a little surprised,
dude. I am in. You know, when you got to go, sometimes you got to go. It was either that or grab a protein bar at the rest stop here, which was very high on the almost to-do list, but I decided to go with the Wendy's. So yeah,
the $12 for the 200-calorie protein bar or something.
Exactly.
Wasn't working
Exactly.
So,
it was either this or Dunkin' Donuts. So I think I made the good choice with Wendy's over Dunkin' Donuts.
Yeah. So good. Well, glad things are going well here. Kind of our first one back this season. I think for the topic for today, I'm really happy to hear a lot more talk about recovery with runners recently. I think that's been something that's been really well grasped by the running community. Even one of my big mantras from this past year was that we're not overtraining, we're under recovering. And I think that's been kind of a big mantra for people to think about. And I like that. However, I'm seeing a huge gap in people's recovery plan. And this gap, I believe, makes all the difference in the world. So today, Scott and I wanted to talk a little bit about what that gap is and how to incorporate it here. So a lot of times when people think of recovery, one of the first things that they think about is, what am I doing every day, right? And people are now saying, okay, I take these supplements, I'm getting good sleep, I'm getting nutrition, I'm using recovery pumps, I'm doing these kind of things, and I'm doing them daily or weekly kind of basis here. But the big element that people are missing that we want to talk about today is an off season. I think this is a huge part of people's training program that people are very resistant to and very hesitant with. But it does make all the difference in the world here. So a lot of my professional runners are just coming off of their off season, and we're getting like in that point in cross country season where we're going to start to think about that transition and a little mini off season between cross country and winter track. So I feel like this is a good timing, and people might not listen to this right away, but it's important to talk about this off season. Even like personally, I'm 2 weeks into my off season, and it can be hard. Personally, I know, like I'll admit that I'm craving a little bit more cardio in my life, but it feels good to be getting in the gym more and doing some of those things. So, Scott, I was
gonna say, I think off season has a bunch of different definitions depending on the type of competitor that you are, right? So, with the Olympics just ending, I have a couple of patients that actually were at the Olympic Games, and to start their off season, like they didn't think about anything activity related, right? They weren't in the gym very much. They were definitely not doing any type of quote unquote, training. I think they just needed to step away from it after spending, most of the year plus, on top of that, more than a year training for the Olympic Games or a big event. Sometimes you just need to get away. And I think that's healthy in and of itself from the standpoint of mental health and just being able to kind of decompress and take away from the stress and the regiment that training really kind of puts you under.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of them now, the Olympic Games were when? June, July-ish? Now we're talking what? Almost November is when they're starting back at their training. So, several months away from just not having to think about get up in the morning, eat this, go lift, go to the track, go do this, sleep, recover. You know what I mean? Like it's very, very taxing on the body and the brain and the mind to have to kind of go through that every single day. Whereas, taking a month or two away and just not having to worry about where you were supposed to be at that given time, is very, very healthy. So that's part of the off season.
And that's a good point too, because you're talking about one extreme where people, it's literally their job.
Correct.
And where it feels, but I bet you there's a lot of people that train for a marathon or an Ironman, and they feel similarly that they feel like this is becoming a job and it's a chore to get it done. And they're beholden to this training program where it says, I got to get my 16-mile run in this week. And if I don't, my timing's off and I'm not going to get this marathon. So I think, one of the elements that I was going to talk about is, well, what constitutes an off season? Like, how long does it have to be considered an off season here, right? And I think it's going to depend, because the flip side of what we were just saying is that there are runners that are very much like, run streak. I want to run every day, and it's part of my personality, and this is how I get rid of my stress, and this is how I cope with just certain things in my life. So the idea of an off season for somebody that's on the flip side of what we talked about might be very unappealing.
So here's the thing also you just mentioned there. So you talk about running to reduce stress. I think running to reduce stress and running as part of like a training day is very, very different, right? So if you run to reduce stress, you're probably not necessarily worrying about your times and your splits and all that other stuff, right? Because that's stress in of itself. So
some, right? Like going out and ripping some 400s once in a while might be a good stress reliever too there, and feel good.
It depends on what your focus is. It depends what your focus is, right? So I just think you just need to keep all of that in mind when designing your program and coming back from your program and really kind of going into the new season with a good, fresh start, as opposed to just rolling from one season to the next and never really recovering and kind of getting the mental break that you may require.
I didn't find any like formulas or calculators or anything like that to say like, hey, like an off season needs to be this long. I think, one of the things with training is that our mental outlook on training is a huge indicator of, are we on that edge of overtraining under recovery type thing. And like you're talking about with, the Olympians and my pro runners, like they need a certain amount of time just to refresh and say like, God, can I love this sport again? Can I be excited enough to spend day in and day out with it? But I think when we're thinking about more the recreational runner, which a lot more of those out there and probably a lot more people working with those or classify themselves as one of those, it's got to be long enough that you feel like I cannot wait to get back to the sport. Like I need to get back to it. And, there's going to be constraints on people's off season by saying, hey, I want to take an off season because, right now this is fall of 2024. People might say, all right, I just did Chicago. I'm going to take an off season for a month before I start training for Boston Marathon or so. And, or they're going to take an off season and they're going to go instead of doing winter track, they're going to play basketball or they're going to swim or do something different before they start signing up for spring track.
Yep.
So a lot of it does depend individually on that. But I think as a general rule of thumb, it's got to be long enough that you feel like you're refreshed and you want to get back to running and participating in a way that is like more regimented and you're geared up for that.
Yeah. And I think, if you're somebody that just likes to run for exercise, you may not need quote unquote an off season. It may be just something that,
I'll bring up a counterpoint to that, right? Okay. So like some of the physiological reason to incorporate, like why should people listen to us about taking an off season right now?
Hold on. Let's define an off season then, right? Yeah. So does off season involve 3 to 4 weeks of cross training? Is that an off season? Or if you do more cross training, is that part of an off season? Like I don't know. I don't know how to define that.
Well, when I thought about it, I think that there can be running in an off season. It's not no running. It's like it is less structured. It is more for enjoyment. It is incorporating other elements and focusing on weaknesses, planning for strengths. But I think at a minimum, people need to take at least 10 days off of no running at some point during the year. And ideally that should be like every 3 months, because of some of the literature we know about how our bones and tendons respond to prolonged.
I agree with you, but I wouldn't classify 10 days as quote unquote an off season. 10 days to me isn't an off season.
No, that's a prolonged rest period. But for a runner, that might be what they're willing to give for an off season there. But
I wouldn't classify that as an off season. I'd call that as a break. I'd call it as a rest period. I'd call it as a deload week. To me that because that could actually be part of your training. Like a deload week is actually still in the season, something that you do to again super compensate and come back even stronger, faster, those type of things. So. I think the term of off season needs to be better defined. And again, it's going to be different from person to person depending on what their goals are. But for me, the way I kind of see it is where your training structure is no longer part of your programming. So you're not programmed into your your microcycles, your macrocycles. There's a specific amount of time, usually weeks at length, where you're not worrying about your training. You're not worried about your training logs, your training goals, and really where you need to
priorities, be. Right? Like Correct. You're saying, hey, I'm prioritizing strength, I'm prioritizing recovery, I'm prioritizing injury rehab or prevention. I'm doing some things that it's at the end of the day, running isn't always the number one thing. It's the thing that you can still participate in. And that's why, like my off season, that I'm starting on now, and I'm going to probably do about 3 or 4 months of this. I cut my running volume by 50%, where I went from 40 miles a week to 20 miles a week. But I'm supplementing that, and my overall training load actually, it dipped for a little bit when I did take my 10 days off of running, but now my training load is at or slightly above even what I was doing before, but I'm swimming twice a week, I'm lifting 5 days a week, I'm prioritizing other things.
Yeah. To me, your off season, exactly that. You're prioritizing other things. So, in our world, the off season is a great time to get bigger and stronger, right?
Yes.
That's really where you can make your headway as a runner, make your headway in the gym. As a football player, make your headway in the gym, where you're not really worrying about the actual task at hand, which is the sport or the skill. You're actually building your base and making your base that much bigger. Because during the season, that's not the time to build your base, so to speak, from a strength perspective. I think it's all boils down to your periodized schedule as to where you want to peak, and I think that will also dictate when you come back and you end your off season, as to how much time you need to get back and put in the time to compete at a high level at a given time. So if you need 4 months to be ready to peak at a certain time, then you need to back those 4 months up, and then you need to resume your training at that time.
Yeah. Backwards math does well for off season there. That's how I design all training programs for people. You put your A priority events on and fill in your B priority events, and then you start to figure out when you need to be in shape for some of those things. But this off season is a good chance to even work on some of those things. I think runners get stressed a lot of times about all the things that they should be doing, but they're too tired or fatigued. Even like when I do a lot of my base mileage, building base mileage, like you were saying, is a great time to do it because I don't care about the pace. I do a lot of my breathing exercises now. So I run all of my easy runs with my mouth closed in the off season. I'm doing that because I don't care if the pace is significantly slower or not. Like I'm just sitting there it's only minutes that matter, right? Understanding, hey, I'm getting this amount of minutes in, it doesn't matter, like this is good for me. So it's a good time to work on all those things that you should be doing, quote unquote, that a lot of times you just don't have time for.
Agreed.
Yeah. And even spending time with family a little bit more, taking my off season now, it's like I'm traveling a good bit for work. And so I want to have more time for family because of that. and holidays are coming up, so I want to be around for some of those things. Even like I'm running with some friends a little bit more that normally maybe I wouldn't run with because we run at different paces. Their pace is either faster or slower than mine, and it's not right, but it's a good chance to do some group runs and get the enjoyment out of it and work on some of those things. I mean, the biggest thing is strength. I think for me in my off season, I have a number one goal is just to keep some muscle mass on and get some strength after that. I think anybody over age 35 should focus on getting in the gym and doing some actual strength stuff where you're not doing 3 sets of 15 with it. You're doing 4 sets of 4 to 6 reps for a month, and then you're going to a 3 or 4 sets of 8 to 10 reps and kind of building up that way.
I wouldn't even say the 35 age. I would say anybody needs to get in the gym during that time.
Yeah. Well, so the trick with the youth, this was another thing. I think with youth, I would actually really encourage them to do a jumping cutting sport up until the time that they're 16.
But they still need to get strong. They still need to get stronger. So
yeah,
I'll
fight you on that too. Mm-hmm. But they need gym time as well. But
yeah, agree.
I think if you're before 16, I wouldn't encourage any kid that's below 16 to specialize and run all year long, right? But we do know that by doing jumping and cutting activities, they're actually setting themselves up for better success later because those types of activities build larger cross-sectional area of the bone. So I would encourage them, like playing basketball is a great way to do an off season. Swimming, I'm a big fan of swimming, and I'm doing a lot of that now, but I'm well over 16, so I'm not building a cross-sectional area in my bones, so it's a good way to unload for me. But in younger kids, they can really benefit from some of that change in forces on the bones there.
Mm-hmm.
So
I agree.
I think that's important for it there. And then, too, there's going to be the off season itself is going to have a little bit of parabola, right? So you're going to kind of it's kind of almost like an inverted U for your training volume. You're going to cut down a little bit, but then you're going to build back up. And the build back up is really important as well, too. And figuring out how do you get adequate base mileage? How do you do some of those things? This is like from the certified endurance coaching course from RunDNA.com there. That one, this is when I use a lot of that 2 mile efficiency test. I use that test a good bit now because that gives us a good opportunity to really look at and give a little objectification and to say like, hey, am I doing my training appropriately? Am I utilizing some of the zone 2 training and am I doing some of those things? And then I think when you come back, one of the biggest mistakes, I had one runner do this coming back from their off season. The biggest mistake that I see people doing coming out of an off season is training at their aspirational pace as opposed to their actual pace. That's a big one there that I see where they say, hey, I want to go run a marathon at 3:30, so they run all their tempo work at what they want to be at, but they realize like they should be training where they're at. And that's where I use that 2 mile timed test as opposed to the 2 mile efficiency test. A 2 mile time test to set some of your training targets and some of your training paces. That makes a big difference coming out of the off season.
Yeah, no, I agree. I like the Jack Daniels 2-minute test as well to kind of talk to you about, what areas of your program need to be developed. Is it more of a endurance issue or is it more of a speed issue? And you can really kind of dial in the whole cycle of where your training is going to be and where your focus needs. And I think you should do that, several times along the plan to make sure that you're making the progress in the areas that you need to, and to make sure you're well rested and, it's a good test and all that good stuff. So, no, I think using gauges such as those are great tools to bring into the program. And they don't necessarily always need to be brought in during the off season. They can be brought in during the season also to just make sure that your training is going the way you want it to.
Yeah, but coming back out of the off season is a perfect time to start and step, forward on the right path there.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're not worried about being sore from doing a 2-mile test. The whole point of it is to not make you overly sore anyway. But it's
a baseline. It's a baseline.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that could be a really great way to kind of come out of it a bit there and just make sure that you're not going to overtrain. We know that running injuries have that 4 to 6 week delay. So people come out and they start increasing their volume kind of quickly. That's the other point. Like even during I might be unique in this, but even during the off season, I still think it's important that you're logging and training, like you're keeping track of those things. I know it feels a little bit more like work that way, but
I think there's some different. I think everyone's going to be unique as to what they really need to get away, and just like anything else, you need to break from, from a nutritional standpoint. You need to break from tracking your calories every single day. It can be very monotonous and very tedious and very, very mentally demanding to do that kind of stuff. So, if you require, if you and your training feel like that is a cumbersome process, then by all means, in your off season, I would not do that. I would definitely change it at that point.
Yeah, people will be different. I mean, for me, I think coming back from some of those things, it's really helpful to have an understanding of like what your training load has been, because I think people advance their training load too quickly coming out of these off seasons. So even just like, hey, just, you don't have to do anything special, but just log it with your wearable, right? Just make sure you're hitting start and stop on those things. And, you might not have to do anything beyond that even, but if you do keep track of those things and understand, you're also going to be able to go back later at the beginning of next year. Because the other thing that the off season is good for is reflecting and saying, okay, hey, like I'm not running as much. Like maybe let me go look back at my training logs and say, why did that race go so well, but another one didn't? What did I do differently? And I think we should do the same thing. Now, I'm admittedly very much a data person, so that's full disclosure. But I think if you're looking at off season, understanding, well, how much was enough, or how much, like maybe somebody goes in and they, instead of cutting their volume back by 50%, maybe they're cutting their volume back by 20%. And maybe that's something that in the next year, if some of their early season races didn't go as well as they'd like, they need to look back and say, hey, I should have backed off a little bit more on this. I should have done some. So I think a training log is really valuable, whether that's a paper one, a digital one, you're using the RunDNA app for like session RPE and doing those things. Like either way, you'd have to have some way to go look back on those things.
And I agree with you. But you said it. That's a training log. It's a training log in the off season. In the off season, that shouldn't be your training log. I think it could be. I think you just need to give yourself. I think most people during the off season need that, especially from the activity that they're training for. Give themselves a break from the actual logging. Now, that doesn't mean that in the weight room they shouldn't be logging their lifts and those type of things. No, I think it's a different focus. I think it's a different focus of attention where you're going to be putting your energy into tracking things. That again, I'm not saying you should totally discount all tracking, but I agree with you. Like even if it's just hitting start or stop on your watch, that would be sufficient in a lot of cases, potentially. But I wouldn't call that your training log, because it shouldn't be training in the off season.
It's funny. You tell Scott's like, well, yeah, you got to track your strength. Like, no, you don't need to track your running. Just shows you the
No. It's just different, because again, if you're talking about running, as your primary, competition, and you're tracking that all year long, you probably should be tracking your weights all year long too, to make sure that you're, progressing the way that you should. But again, I just think that in the off season, where your focus of attention needs to definitely shift, and less emphasis needs to be put on those things that you personally, you personally feel is cumbersome and something that creates more added complications to your ability to just get away.
Right. I agree with the sentiment that the off season shouldn't feel taxing or shouldn't
Yes.
feel stressful.
Exactly.
That's
Exactly.
exactly
Exactly.
that, right?
Exactly.
Now, I think a lot of people like a little training log, like we're talking about, keeping track of sets and reps with the weights, keeping track of time at least
Mhm.
with your runs and how much time you're spending. I think that's important stuff. That's just most people are going to get that information no matter what. I mean, maybe people do need a watch holiday where they're not wearing their Garmin watch but if you're not going to run for 2 weeks, that's probably going to be enough of a reset for most people because we
Maybe.
are saying that we should start an off season with a period of no running. So if you start it off, that's probably going to be enough of a chance for people to reset some of that mental fatigue around more of the tracking. But the overarching principle is, listen to what your brain is telling you is hard to do. Now, but at the same point, Scott even mentioned nutrition earlier. Yeah, like you shouldn't be counting calories or things like that. But you also want to say, hey, maybe I know a lot of people, like when I train a lot, I eat a lot more candy when I'm
Yep.
training because
Mhm.
I don't want to buy expensive gels all the time. So I'll just grab some leftover Halloween candy and grab like a Snickers and go eat it. And it's like it's time for me to clean up some of that eating in the off season because I don't need the ready source of fuel as quickly all the time. And there's the psychology of like, well, if I'm eating a Snickers on a run, what's another thing if I grab a little Snickers bite now? And so I think nutrition is a good chance to say like, hey, let's like take the time to cook good meals. Take the time to figure out the meals that you like and that are easy, and find the enjoyment of cooking or food prep, or find things that work for you where you're not worried about I got to get a certain amount of protein in after this workout, or I got to get a certain number of calories in. Like eat for enjoyment as opposed, but focus on good nutrition at the same time in an off season.
Yeah. Yeah.
McDonald's or Wendy's isn't going to be the the thing, but Scott's on the road and he said, like, listen, I'm not going to eat, or I'm going to eat Wendy's today. Okay,
Mhm.
much better to have something to eat than to have nothing.
Debatable. Debate. My body fat percentage will tell you otherwise, but
Yeah, yeah,
it's no.
that's funny.
You bring up good points. It's all about choices, right? It's about choices, about decisions. Sometimes the easiest option isn't the best option.
Yeah.
Um, Nutrition in the off season. If you're talking about it from a body composition standpoint, I can speak to some experience there. In a body composition standpoint, a lot of people stop tracking what they're eating in the off season because, again, tracking is taxing. It's mentally fatiguing. Um, Planning out your meals for every meal of the day for 6 meals. Making sure that your carbs, your fats, your protein hit a certain target. That can be a pain in the neck every single day, and a lot of times
Yeah.
people eat the same thing every day because, again, it is so challenging to work with that every other day. To make it easy on yourself, if you eat the same thing, you know what you're getting. Whereas in the off season, you shouldn't have to worry about that. A lot of people in the off season just eat till they're full, or get an idea. That's when they have those quote unquote more of those cheat meals. But
Hmm.
again, intuitive eating is the term that people like to use oftentimes. But again, I think the bottom line of all of this is off season is very dependent on the activity, and what your off season is comprised of, again, depends heavily on what you're getting away from. Because if nutrition is a big part of what you need to be doing during your season, then the off season should maybe not be doing nearly as much of that. Just like running, if running is your primary focus, then maybe the off season should be less of that. How much less? Again, it's going to depend on what your goals are, what you're coming back from, what you're trying to take a break from. Um, but it's a time for your body to recover. It's a time for your mind to recover. It's a time for you to, not be totally consumed, and to, like you said, Doug, to get back to the activity that you love and to really regain the love for doing it. So I think it's going to, and certain sports don't have a very long off season.
Right.
Because if you step away from the actual sport for too long, it becomes dangerous for you to get back to it, or you're not able to get back to it because you lose so much of what you need to compete at the high level that your body can't really I can tell you, like, for example, gymnasts take a very, very short off season because if they get away from doing the skills for too long, it takes too long for them to return back to that level. So every sport, every skill is going to be a little different. What your body needs to recover is going to be a little different. And how extreme you go with that off season is going to vary depending on, again, you as a person and your goals.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I agree. And I would also just add like one final point for me on this here is that it is performance beneficial to take an off season.
Yeah.
Like performance doesn't go just linear. A lot of times we see like performance starts to reduce some of the gains, and it goes much more in a step pattern where you have like, you go a little recovery period, then you bump up, and then a little recovery period and you bump up. And I think with that, we talked about periodization, we talked about, different things and different cycles. And I think that a lot of people, if they actually took an off season like we're talking about, would find a performance boost. And I'm not familiar with some of the literature.
Especially if they can rebuild themselves in the off season.
Exactly.
To be bigger, stronger, faster. Yes, you hope to see a performance boost in that. Absolutely.
Yeah.
But again, it's not one equal. It's not run faster in the off season to get faster during the season. No, it's build up your capacity and to get tissue stronger and create more power. And that's how you build the benefit into the season with regards to running.
Yeah. So don't sleep on the off season there, or get lots of sleep in the off season is maybe what we should be saying here. But it's an important part of a training program that a lot of people are not doing. They think about, because running is so much of an identity for people, they'll often think about it that they can't take an off season because they're a runner. They don't run, they're a runner, so I can't take an off season with this. But I think the way that we've talked about the off season today, where it doesn't mean there's no running, it means that you're focusing on restoration and recuperation, as well as just letting your body physically recover, can really make a big difference for a lot of people. So hopefully this will inspire some people to start thinking about it, planning their off season a little bit more and incorporating that in. I think you'll be really happy that you did.
I agree.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening to RunDNA Podcast. As always, we hope you're running happy and healthy, and let us know if you have any thoughts on recovery and off seasons yourself or any literature. Please share it. And until next time, we'll talk to you then.
Bye guys. Thanks.
Like what you hear? Leave a review of the show wherever you listen, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. RunDNA helps runners and running specialists through education and technology to identify each runner's unique injury profile to avoid setbacks and maximize results. The RunDNA Podcast is produced by Ace Running LLC. The RunDNA Podcast is intended for educational purposes only. No clinical decision-making should be based solely on one source. While care is taken to ensure accuracy, factual errors can occur. Always seek the guidance of qualified medical professionals before making healthcare decisions. Find us online at rundna.com.